That's tremendous. This was not a request. This was Greg and I making small talk. Sorry. About, this is the first time I've recorded in 2 weeks. It's crazy. We're Hamburger Hill. And there's a movie called Hamburger Hill, but this is a battle that took place in Vietnam, as some people say. This is called 2 Weeks of Hell, Vietnam's Bloody Battle of Hamburger Hill. Hamburger. This was not a request, but this is one of those videos where if you can watch the movie, it's just brutal. So let's just do a little recap of that, and we're going to start it right now.
Was a conflict in which the might of modern military technology was pitched against an enemy who made up for their shortfall with tenacity and ingenuity. For the leaders of both sides, it was a war of wills, with defeat seemingly as unthinkable to those in Washington as it was to the North Vietnamese in Hanoi. At times, the war seemed more about destroying the enemy than achieving strategic goals.
Yeah.
And few places was this more apparent than in the jungle and in the hills of the A Shau Valley in 1969. It was here that the US and North Vietnamese forces would demonstrate their true grit and hatred for one another as they fought for a hill that had almost no real value in the unfolding conflict. On military maps, it was known as Hill 937, in reference to its height in meters. To history, it is known as Hamburger Hill. Welcome to Wars of the World.
Well, that was fast. Damn.
This game.
That was a fast little... Let's go. Come on, let's get back to it. Come on now.
The conflict in Southeast Asia during the 1960s and early 1970s was by no means limited to the boundaries of North and South Vietnam. Fearing a communist invasion of the pro-US South, the United States aided in fortifying the South Vietnamese side of the demilitarized zone, making any direct assault by any North Vietnamese army extremely costly, if not impossible. The idea was to keep the North contained, while US and South Vietnamese forces battled the communist Viet Cong guerrillas in the South. However, the North Vietnamese leader, Ho Chi Minh, with his upper echelons, had no intention of abandoning their brothers in the South. They therefore concocted a strategy whereby an intricate series of trails would bypass the defenses along the DMZ by traveling through dense jungles of neighboring Cambodia and Laos, and then trickling into South Vietnam. Forever after dubbed the Ho Chi Minh Trail in honor of the Communist North's leader in the fight to unify Vietnam under a red banner, it was a masterpiece in organization and improvisation that at first ferried supplies to the Viet Cong to keep them in the fight, and would later send North Vietnamese army troops south to join the struggle. Cutting off the Ho Chi Minh Trail was therefore seen as one of the keys to victory in the Vietnam War for the Americans, and a great deal of effort was put into locating and destroying its many trails. Every conceivable weapon was used to destroy its many end routes in Vietnam, and occasionally across the border, ranging from infantry actions to airstrikes by B-52 Stratofortress strategic bombers. It was a frustrating task for the American commanders, as it was often difficult to gauge the success of such operations. One area that was key to the influx of supplies into the northern regions of South Vietnam was the A Shau Valley, located near the Laotian border, west of the vital coastal city of Hue. As well as a major supply route, the valley had served as a staging area for several North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong assaults in the region. Consequently, between April 1968 and May 1969, US and South Vietnamese forces conducted 3 massive military sweeps in the area, coinciding with heavy air and artillery strikes designed to dislodge the communist forces entrenched there. However, despite sustaining over 2,000 casualties, the Asho Valley remained largely in the hands of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. This led to the conception of a fourth sweep, scheduled to begin on May 10, 1969. Dubbed Operation Apache Snow, the operation would involve 3,000 troops, again backed up by heavy air and artillery support, conducting a surprise offensive against the North Vietnamese Army's 29th Regiment from the west of the valley. Leading the charge would be units of the famed 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. On the morning of May 10, 1969, Apache Snow began, with 3 infantry battalions of the 101st being inserted by Huey helicopters. Beginning at 812 hours, the lead elements of the 101st began landing in the valley and pushing eastward, followed by the main force comprising of the 1st Battalion's 506th Regiment, the 2nd Battalion's 501st, and the 3rd Battalion's 187th, as well as the Army of the Republic of Vietnam's 1st Regiment. The speed at which the heliborne troops arrived in the area achieved its goal of catching the North Vietnamese army by almost total surprise. The North Vietnamese troops engaged the American forces in skirmishes before initiating a fighting retreat, allowing the US forces to conduct a reconnaissance in-force operation to weed out any communist troops left behind. Following blood trails from wounded North Vietnamese soldiers being dragged by their comrades through the jungle, it became obvious to the 101st that they were retreating towards Hill 937, where they would most likely make their stand. As they continued their pursuit of the fleeing North Vietnamese, it also became clear that they would likely be dealing with a well-fortified and entrenched enemy, as they discovered abandoned bunkers and evidence of an intricate communications network supporting a large military presence. On the second day, Bravo Company of the 3rd...
I'm guessing they had like foxholes all over the place. Foxholes. Is that what I'm thinking of? Yeah, like little foxholes connecting like little chambers under the ground. I think that was I think that was how they were able to... I shouldn't say that. That was, I know, in the movie We Were Soldiers. That's another good movie. That was how they were coming out of the ground at certain areas. So I'm guessing they were probably doing the same thing here.
Battalion, 187th Regiment, began taking heavy fire from a North Vietnamese bunker, and during the firefight, called in Huey Cobra gunships to provide cover as they withdrew. Tragically, a Huey Cobra mistook a group of US troops for North Vietnamese forces and fired a salvo of rockets onto their position, resulting in several casualties. By now, the commander of the 187th Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, had learned the identity of the enemy force facing them and relished the opportunity of engaging one of the North Vietnamese Army's most respected units, the 29th, which had earned the moniker of being the pride of Ho Chi Minh. On May 12th, Honeycutt ordered members of the regiment to move in on Hill 937 in order to assess enemy positions where Bravo Company again came under heavy enemy fire. Unable to advance further, intense US air support was called in and began bombarding the 29th Regiment's positions, but it would prove in vain, and by the end of the day, the US troops were forced to withdraw and dig in for the night. As they rested and resupplied, North Vietnamese troops reoccupied and repaired their lost defensive positions, meaning that when the US attacked again, their progress from the day before had been nullified, and this would set a tragic trend for the coming days. On May 13th, 1969, fearing the arrival of North Vietnamese reinforcements from the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, the 3rd Battalion moved to occupy nearby Hill 916 and then await support from 1st Battalion 506th Regiment, who were expected to arrive within 48 hours. Bravo, Charlie, and Delta companies of the 187th Regiment were soon again in action, taking intense enemy fire, and their progress was severely hampered by the terrain, which included small ravines, stream beds, and where US aircraft hadn't blasted the hill yet, dense jungle, in which North Vietnamese snipers concealed themselves and caused carnage amongst the American troops. As a result, none of the companies reached their objectives, instead becoming bogged down, leading to yet more intensive airstrikes pounding and burning Hill 937. On May 14th, After even more airstrikes, Bravo and Charlie companies attacked from the west of the hill, while Delta moved in from the north. Delta Company faced intense opposition, and during an attempt to evacuate its wounded, a medical evacuation helicopter was hit and crashed. Bravo and Charlie companies equally met heavy opposition as they encountered traps and suicide snipers, men who tied themselves to the tops of the remaining trees, looking to hold down or kill as many US troops as possible before they were themselves killed, in order to cover the retreat. Bravo and Charlie companies managed to reach the summit of Hill 937, whereupon they reported back to their commanders that the area was littered with the bodies of enemy troops, but they were now at risk of being surrounded and badly mauled, and so were forced to retreat, giving the hill back to the 29th. Once again, during the night, the North Vietnamese reoccupied and refortified their positions on the hill, leaving the US forces with the grim realization they were going to have to do it all again the next day.
Jeez.
But
now, I have seen the movie Hamburger Hill, but it's been a while. I didn't remember the strategy behind it. I just remember hearing that you would get it and then give it up, and then they would come back, and then you'd get the hill again and give it up, and they'd come back, and then it's pretty much like that. I didn't realize it was 2 weeks, but I mean, it gets to a point where you're like, you secure the hill, and now what? Okay, you got a random hill. Great. What are you gonna do with it? You gonna build a munitions factory there? You gonna build a bubblegum factory? What are we doing with this hill? Why is this hill so significant? If we keep giving it up, then why do we need it? Move on. Go somewhere else. That's my thinking.
by this time, with his 187th Regiment taking a heavy beating on the slopes of Hill 937, Lieutenant Colonel Honeycutt was dismayed to learn that elsewhere, US forces involved in Apache snow had seen little action, and so he communicated with the 3rd Battalion commander, Colonel Joseph Comney, expressing his frustration. Quote, "The bastards have got heavy weapons, they're dug in, they've got defense in depth, and they're moving fresh troops up those draws from Laos every night, and I don't have the manpower to stop them. We're in a goddamn fight here, Joe, and I mean a fight." Comney agreed and promised more assistance in taking the hill. On May 15th, Hill 916 was secured, but Bravo Company once again found itself caught up in very heavy enemy fire, prompting a request for assistance from helicopter gunships. Somewhere along the line of communication to the gunships, the message of where the enemy was located became confused, and so with the Huey Cobras swooping in from the opposite direction of where they were expected, they mistakenly fired rockets at Bravo Company that killed 2 and wounded 14. The next day, the 1st Battalion, 506th Regiment, joined in the fray, conducting probing attacks on Hill 937 to test for weaknesses that could be exploited in a major push in conjunction with the 187th and the South Vietnamese. Honeycutt, meanwhile, had himself received wounds from a rocket-propelled grenade attack on his bunker by a nighttime North Vietnamese assault force, but remained in the area with his men. American troops resting during the night also had to contend with the North Vietnamese tactic of rolling hand grenades down the hill onto their positions, meaning there was very little rest for anyone in the periods between assaults. With little else going on in the valley, the intense combat soon began attracting the attention of several war correspondents who descended on the hill to speak to US soldiers returning from assault after assault. One such soldier interviewed was 19-year-old Sergeant James Spears, who said to the reporter, "Have you ever been inside a hamburger machine? We just got cut to pieces by extremely accurate machine gun fire." As a result, Hill 937 became immortalized in the American consciousness as Hamburger Hill. On May 18th, the surviving members of the 187th and the recently arrived 506th launched a joint attack on Hill 937, following heavy air and artillery barrages. During the attack, tear gas was deployed in an effort to reduce the defenders' ability to function, but it was misdirected and ended up either blowing away on the wind or actually inhibiting members of the 187th instead. Nevertheless, Alpha and Delta companies of the 187th made good progress, and the summit of Hill 937 was tantalizingly close, despite them still taking heavy machine gun and mortar fire from enemy positions. Honeycutt was convinced that he would finally capture Hamburger Hill after redeploying Charlie Company to provide support, and even traveled to the scene to be there at the end. Sadly for the Americans, fate had other ideas. The skies suddenly opened with an exceptionally heavy rainfall, turning the slopes of the hill to sludge, slime, and mud, which in some places was 3 feet deep, making it completely impassable. Honeycutt therefore had no choice but to once again order a retreat down the hill. It had now been 8 days that his men had been fighting to take hold of Hill 937, and in that time they had been mauled, with Delta Company no longer having any officers left, they either having been killed or medevaced. Fresh troops were again pulled into the fray, and more assaults followed in the days after. On May 20th, US air and artillery blasted North Vietnamese positions for over 2 hours prior to another US assault. Many of these same positions having been bombed, abandoned, captured, abandoned in the American retreat, and then reoccupied and repaired by the North Vietnamese several times over the previous 10 days. Attacking in strength, the US troops made good progress through midday, reaching the crest of the hill before organizing yet another assault on the summit. The 29th Regiment appeared unable to stand any more punishment, and its survivors began to trickle away into the jungle, hoping to bypass the massive American force rallied against them or make a defiant last stand, killing as many as they could before the end. By 1700 hours, news trickled back that Hamburger Hill had been secured. Just over 2 weeks later, on June 5th, 1969, having no strategic value in the unfolding conflict, it was abandoned.
That is what pisses me off more than anything. It had no strategic value, so they let it go. Then why fight for it? I self-censored myself there. Did you like that? Why fight for it? I understand, well, the enemy's there, we have to kill the enemy. Okay, fine. But if you've just fought 2 weeks for that hill, you better believe I would still own that hill today. I would fly there once a week and cut the grass with a push mower. I would build a shed on it if I had to. I don't care. There should have been a flag planted in that like in the moon. Like, I wouldn't have given it up after all that, and it was just given up. Oh. No, it wasn't.
The Vietnam War has been mired in controversy for a number of reasons, but the battle for Hamburger Hill stands out almost as an allegory for the entire conflict. While the reasoning for Operation Apache Snow was sound, critics have questioned the value of taking Hill 937, with 11 consecutive infantry assaults, other than to try and inflict as many casualties on the enemy side as possible. Some of the more cynical observers of the battle at the time, and since, have claimed it was little more than an effort to preserve some degree of prestige, given the unpopularity of the war and the string of setbacks encountered over the previous 5 years. However, supporters of the action point out that the battle for Hamburger Hill demonstrated the effectiveness of large infantry actions and herald the battle as a major victory. It demonstrated that American fighting men were every bit as tenacious as the opponents they fought, and that the support network that was set in place, particularly the medical evacuation helicopter force, meant that US fatalities were at least significantly fewer than they would have been had the same circumstances occurred in previous wars. However, even those who herald the battle as a victory can't deny that it added 56 more names to the American Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. And while estimates on North Vietnamese casualties vary between 600 and 1,000, in the grand scheme of things, it didn't matter. Within days of the US troops leaving Hamburger Hill behind, the North Vietnamese army moved to reoccupy and refortify it, leaving the families of those US troops killed to ask, was it worth it? It is a question that seems impossible to answer.
No, it's possible. No. There you go. No. What? When I hit pause, what do you think that means? Keep playing? Stupid son of a... Okay, yeah, nope. Wasn't worth it. If there was a shoe factory there making Nikes, all right. I don't wear them, but you know, jobs for people there, whatever. There was a strip mall there, all right, maybe. But no, not with what happened. No, not at all. The 54 or 56 dead on the American side, 600 to 1,000 dead on the other side. For what? For a hill that no one really, like, we didn't care about it. It's just, it's annoying. It's 650 or 1,050 deaths for nothing. Just annoying. All right. Ow. I'm going to end this here. Like and subscribe. And until next time, have a good day, have a good night.